Under the gentle glow of a late April sunrise in rural Montana, an extraordinary secret unfolds behind the weathered red walls of an old barn. In a quiet hayloft, where the scent of aged wood mingles with the whisper of dawn, nature dares to defy its own rules. An old farmer, Tom Wilkins, whose life has been etched into the land for generations, witnesses an act that transcends instinct. Inside his barn, a predator perches, a peregrine falcon named Aurora. But this is no ordinary sight. Beneath her protective wings lie three tiny bobcat cubs, helpless and orphaned, yet cradled in an embrace that should have been impossible. Why would a fierce bird of prey, built for the hunt, take on the role of a mother to the very creature she might see as prey? What unfolds next not only challenges scientific understanding, but leaves wildlife experts utterly speechless. This is the story of an unlikely family that defied the rules of the wild and redefined the boundaries of love and survival. The late April sun cast long shadows across Tom Wilkins' sprawling farm in rural Montana. The 67-year-old farmer had spent most of his life on this land, inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Wilkins men had worked this soil, raised cattle on these pastures, and weathered both literal and figurative storms within these weathered red barn walls. But nothing in Tom's 6 decades of farm life had prepared him for what he discovered that spring morning. It began with unusual sounds coming from the hayloft, soft, high-pitched mewling that didn't match any of the familiar animal calls he'd grown accustomed to over the years. Tom's arthritic knees protested as he climbed the wooden ladder to investigate, his curiosity outweighing the discomfort. What he found left him speechless. Nestled in the corner of the hayloft, partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales, was a female peregrine falcon, distinctive with her slate-blue back, barred white underparts, and sharp yellow eyes. But it wasn't the falcon's presence that stunned Tom. It was what surrounded her. 3 tiny spotted bobcat cubs, no more than 2 weeks old, their eyes barely open, huddled against her feathered body. The falcon wasn't attacking or threatening the cubs. She was protecting them, grooming them. When Tom approached, the falcon spread her wings defensively over the tiny felines, her sharp gaze fixing on him with unmistakable warning. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom whispered, backing away slowly. He knew enough about wildlife to understand how extraordinary, how impossible, this scene should be. Falcons were predatory birds. Bobcats were predators too, though of a different class entirely. Natural law dictated they should be adversaries, not whatever this was. As he carefully descended the ladder, Tom's weathered hands trembled slightly. This was beyond his experience. He needed help from someone who might make sense of this unlikely alliance. Mark Bennett had been a wildlife rehabilitator for nearly 15 years in Gallatin County, Montana. At 42, his passion for rehabilitating injured and orphaned wildlife had only grown stronger with time. His small rehabilitation center, nestled at the edge of town, had treated everything from orphaned bear cubs to injured golden eagles. Mark's reputation for successfully rehabilitating and releasing animals back into the wild had earned him the respect of locals and wildlife officials alike. When his phone rang that morning, he was elbow-deep in preparing formula for a litter of orphaned raccoons. "Bennett Wildlife Rehab." He answered, phone tucked between ear and shoulder. "Mark, it's Tom Wilkins." The old farmer's voice sounded strange, almost shaky. "I've got something out of my place you need to see. Something, well, I don't rightly know how to explain it." Mark had known Tom for years, a steady, practical man, not given to exaggeration. The uncertainty in his voice immediately captured Mark's attention. 20 minutes later, Mark's battered pickup truck bounced down the dirt road leading to the Wilkins farm. Tom was waiting by the barn, his weather-beaten face etched with concern and wonder. "Thanks for coming so quick," Tom said, extending a calloused hand. "It's up in the hayloft. Been watching from a distance. Didn't want to disturb them again." "What exactly are we looking at, Tom?" Mark asked, retrieving his equipment bag from the truck bed. Tom rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "A peregrine falcon, female, I think, and 3 bobcat cubs. Tiny ones." Mark paused. You mean the Falcon is hunting the cubs? No. Tom shook his head emphatically. She's caring for them, like they're her own. Never seen anything like it in all my years. Mark's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. That's highly unusual, to put mildly. Let me take a look. Together, they approached the barn, their footsteps hushed on the packed earth floor. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of hay and old wood. Mark followed Tom to the ladder, his mind racing through possible explanations, all of them inadequate. I'll go up first, Mark whispered. Stay back a bit so we don't overwhelm them. With practiced care, Mark ascended the ladder, moving slowly to minimize noise. As his head cleared the hayloft floor, he paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the different quality of light filtering through the small windows. And then he saw them, just as Tom had described. A female peregrine falcon was perched protectively beside 3 tiny bobcat cubs. The cubs were small enough that their eyes were just beginning to open, their spotted fur still downy soft. They couldn't have been more than 2 weeks old. What struck Mark immediately was the falcon's behavior. She was engaged in what could only be described as nurturing activity, using her beak to gently groom one of the cubs, much as a mother bobcat would lick her offspring. As Mark watched, scarcely breathing, one of the cubs mewed weakly, and the falcon responded with a soft, trilling call. Nothing like her typical hunting screech. Mark carefully retrieved his camera from his bag, documenting the scene with the steady hands of someone accustomed to working around wild animals. The falcon eyed him warily, but didn't abandon her charges. That alone was remarkable. Wild peregrines were typically fiercely territorial and would normally flee from human presence. After several minutes of careful observation, Mark descended to where Tom waited. Well? The farmer asked, his weathered face expectant. Mark shook his head in amazement. It's exactly as you described. I've never seen anything like this in my entire career. Those cubs are orphans, no doubt about it. But somehow, this falcon has adopted them. He scrolled through the photos on his camera. This defies everything we understand about both species. What do we do now? Tom asked. Mark considered carefully. First, we need to figure out what happened to the mother bobcat. Cubs this young would never be abandoned willingly. He glanced toward the hayloft. Second, we need to understand if these cubs can actually survive under the falcon's care. They have very different nutritional needs. As if on cue, a shadow passed over the barn door. Both men turned to see the falcon swooping in, a small rabbit clutched in her talons. She disappeared up into the hayloft. Well, she's feeding them, Tom observed. Yes, but how? Mark wondered aloud. Bobcat cubs that age wouldn't be able to tear apart prey on their own, and falcons don't regurgitate food like some birds do. The answer came moments later when they heard the distinctive sounds of the falcon tearing the rabbit into small, manageable pieces. Mark ascended the ladder again, just enough to peek over the edge. What he saw astonished him further. The falcon was meticulously shredding the meat into tiny strips, placing them directly in front of each cub's mouth. The cubs, though clumsy, were attempting to eat the offering. Mark snapped more photos, his mind already composing the email he would send to Dr. Eleanor Langston at Montana State University. If anyone could help make sense of this unprecedented behavior, it would be Eleanor, whose work on avian cognition and adaptive behaviors had made her a respected figure in wildlife biology circles. Dr. Eleanor Langston arrived at the Wilkins farm the following morning, her university-issued SUV laden with equipment. At 58, she had the air of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors, her skin tanned and lined from years of field work, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes, however, retained the sharp curiosity that had driven her distinguished career studying avian behavior. "This better be good, Mark," she said, accepting his help with a case of monitoring equipment. "I canceled 2 faculty meetings for this." Mark grinned. "Trust me, Eleanor. In 30 years, you'll still be talking about what's in that barn." Tom joined them, offering Eleanor a firm handshake. "Dr. Langston, appreciate you coming all this way. Please, call me Eleanor," she insisted. "Now, let's see this miracle Mark's been raving about." Inside the barn, Mark briefed Eleanor on his observations from the previous day. "I've been calling her Aurora, he admitted, somewhat sheepishly. After the Roman goddess of dawn. It seemed fitting somehow. Eleanor nodded absently, her mind already focused on the scientific implications. If what you're describing is accurate, we're witnessing behavior that contradicts everything we understand about interspecies interaction, particularly between predator species. See for yourself, Mark said, gesturing toward the ladder. With the agility of someone half her age, Eleanor climbed to the hayloft, her movements careful and measured. Mark and Tom followed at a respectful distance. The scene that greeted them had evolved since Mark's last visit. The Falcon, Aurora, had arranged the hay into a more nest-like formation, creating a shallow depression where the three cubs now rested. She stood at the edge of this improvised nest, her posture alert but not alarmed by the human observers. Eleanor slowly raised her binoculars, her breath catching audibly. "Extraordinary," she murmured. "The orientation of her body, the way she's positioned herself between us and the cubs, that's textbook protective behavior." Aurora watched them intently, occasionally making low vocalizations that seemed to soothe the cubs when they stirred restlessly. "How is this possible?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't falcons and bobcats normally try to kill each other?" Eleanor lowered her binoculars, her expression thoughtful. Adult bobcats and falcons would certainly view each other as either competition or potential threats. But these cubs, she paused, considering, they're young enough that they don't register as bobcats to Aurora. Something has triggered her maternal instincts. But why? How? Mark pressed. Could she have lost a clutch of her own? Might explain the displaced maternal behavior. Eleanor nodded. Possible. We should check for abandoned peregrine nests in the area. She made a note on her tablet. But that still doesn't explain why she's not simply treating these cubs as prey. By late afternoon, their monitoring system was operational, feeding live video to Eleanor's laptop set up in Tom's kitchen. The three of them gathered around the screen, watching as Aurora meticulously groomed each cub in turn. "Look at that." Eleanor pointed to the screen. "She's using her beak in a way that mimics the rasping action of a cat's tongue. She's actually adapted her grooming technique to match what these cubs would expect from their biological mother." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just unusual behavior. It represented an unprecedented level of behavioral adaptation, a cross-species nurturing that defied conventional understanding of wildlife biology. "What about feeding?" Tom asked practically. "Those little ones need meat, and lots of it." As if answering his question, the camera captured Aurora becoming suddenly alert, her head turning toward the barn's upper window. With a powerful thrust of her wings, she launched herself out of the hayloft. "She's going hunting," Eleanor said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Let's see what happens when she returns." They didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, Aurora returned, carrying a ground squirrel. The cameras captured her methodical preparation of the meal, using her sharp beak and talons to skin and dismember the prey, then further breaking down the meat into tiny, manageable pieces that the cubs could handle. "She's modifying her feeding behavior," Eleanor observed, her academic detachment momentarily overtaken by wonder. "Falcons typically tear off pieces for themselves, but she's preparing food specifically for cubs with different feeding capabilities." More remarkable still was what happened next. As the cubs fed clumsily on the prepared meat, Aurora made a series of soft vocalizations, different from typical falcon calls. The cubs, surprisingly, seemed to respond to these sounds, orienting toward her. "She's developing a communication system with them," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide. This challenges everything we understand about interspecies interaction." Over the next 2 weeks, Tom's barn became the center of an impromptu research station. Eleanor, unable to tear herself away from what she called the opportunity of a lifetime, had taken emergency leave from her university duties. Mark split his time between his rehabilitation center and the farm, while Tom found himself hosting not only wildlife, but also an expanding team of researchers who arrived initially skeptical, only to depart as converted believers in the miracle of Aurora and her cubs. The team named the 3 bobcat cubs Maple, Sage, and Rusty. Maple for her reddish-brown coat, Sage for her thoughtful green eyes, and Rusty for the distinctive rust-colored markings around his ears. As the days passed, their eyes fully opened, and they began exploring their hayloft world with increasing confidence. Aurora's care for them evolved as well. Camera footage documented her teaching behaviors, demonstrations of how to clean their paws, using her own preening movements as examples, how to stay silent when potential threats approached, and even rudimentary hunting practice using feathers and small sticks she brought to the nest. She's not just caring for them, Eleanor explained during an impromptu lecture to her assembled colleagues in Tom's living room. She's teaching them how to be predators, adapting falcon hunting techniques to suit feline capabilities. Most astonishing to the scientific team was the emergence of what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system between Aurora and each cub. She developed distinct calls for each one, 3 different sounds that would summon Maple, Sage, or Rusty specifically. The cubs, in turn, began responding to Aurora with their own vocalizations, creating unique interspecies language that left the researchers both baffled and amazed. We're witnessing the development of what amounts to a cross-species dialect, Dr. Harmon Reyes, a linguist who specialized in animal communication, explained to the group. Aurora is essentially creating a pidgin language that blends falcon calls with adaptations designed to be recognizable to the bobcat cubs. For Tom Wilkins, whose quiet farm life had been upended by this scientific phenomenon, the experience brought unexpected joy. Each evening, after the researchers had retired to their tents or returned to town for the night, he would climb up to the hayloft alone, sitting quietly in the corner, watching Aurora and her unlikely family. "You're something special, girl," he would tell the falcon softly. "Don't quite understand what you're doing or why, but it's something special all the same." Aurora, who had grown accustomed to Tom's presence, would sometimes acknowledge him with a gentle bob of her head before returning to her maternal duties. As April gave way to May, the cubs grew rapidly, their bodies transforming from helpless infants to more recognizable miniature predators. They played together in the hay, pouncing and wrestling, developing the coordination and strength they would need for survival. Aurora supervised these activities with what could only be described as maternal pride, occasionally intervening when play became too rough. The question nobody could answer definitively was what had happened to the cubs' biological mother. Mark organized several search parties that combed the surrounding woods and fields, eventually discovering the remains of an adult female bobcat about a half-mile from Tom's property. The evidence suggested she had been struck by a vehicle on the nearby county road. She must have been moving her litter, Mark theorized. Maybe from one den to another, got hit, but somehow the cubs survived and made their way to the barn. And Aurora found them. Eleanor continued the thought. At precisely the right moment, when her own maternal instincts were activated. A perfect storm of circumstances. Agreed, Dr. Reyes said. What nobody discusses openly, but everyone considers privately, is the looming question. What will happen when the cubs outgrow their foster mother? By mid-May, each cub was already nearly equal to Aurora in size, though they still behaved as her offspring, following her direction and responding to her calls. The answer began to emerge in late May, as Aurora initiated what Eleanor termed independence training. Camera footage captured the falcon leading the cubs, now significantly more mobile, to the edge of the hayloft, where she demonstrated how to navigate the descent to the barn floor. She would fly down, then call to them, encouraging them to follow. Initially hesitant, the cubs eventually mastered the climb down, their natural feline agility serving them well. Once on the barn floor, Aurora expanded their world further, guiding them outside during the quiet pre-dawn hours when the researchers were still asleep. Mark, who had taken to sleeping in his truck near the barn to monitor nighttime activities, described the sight. She led them in single file across the barnyard, like a teacher with school children. When Rusty strayed toward the open field, she swooped down in front of him, herding him back to safety. By early June, these excursions had extended further from the barn, with Aurora teaching the cubs crucial survival skills. She showed them how to use hay bales and fence posts as vantage points, demonstrated stalking techniques adapted for ground hunters, and continued to provide them with food while encouraging their own hunting attempts. The most remarkable aspect of this education was Aurora's apparent awareness of the cubs' different nature and capabilities. She never tried to make them fly or perform falcon-specific behaviors. Instead, she seemed to understand their inherent feline nature and tailored her lessons accordingly. She's essentially created a hybrid parenting approach, Eleanor explained during a presentation to colleagues who had traveled from as far as California to witness the phenomenon. She's blending